While Hong Kong is stretching into its 11th week of protest, the Hong Kong business community is worried about the violence and its impact on the city's status as an Asian financial hub. So how does Hong Kong come to this chaos? And what's behind the violence? Where is Hong Kong's way out? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by He Jing, an attorney of Anjie Law Firm, and James Nolt, an associate professor at New York University. We'll also speak via satellite to Hong Wei-ming, the Hong Kong deputy to the 13th National People's Congress, who is now in Hong Kong. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Dong Shi. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I want to start with the current state of things. The Hong Kong International Airport has had a turbulent week where some very heated confrontations happened, and it pretty much became the front line of the protests and demonstrations this week. Now there's a court order in place to restrict the protesters only to a designated area of the airport. Mr. He, let me start with you here. Where are things headed next?
I think, well, before we're looking at where things are heading next, we probably have looking at really what has happened, right? Now, first of all, people are really worried about all the violence or the problems that happened in the airport, all the disruptions. When the large crowd of people there.
It's really taken things to another different level this week, hasn't it?
Right. Yeah. But the good thing is, well, as a legal professional, we're really relieved to see the court order seems making some impact. Okay. Well, some people argue that may not be because of court order, but for us, we'd rather believe is that because whoever demonstrated, the people somehow respect the court order. So that try to give us the hint that what should be done in the future or what's going to happen next. Well, we don't expect people are going to, suddenly stop all the protests or demonstration. But if things that continue, more rally, more demonstration, more protests, now we have to let the court system work. We have to let the system work the way the Hong Kong has been, all right? And that's probably the only choice. That's probably the only choice. Now, that's part of the legal side, the law and order. But on the political side, what kind of conversation can happen that can make all the different stakeholders, different sides, can somehow find some solution, can rebuild something, maybe rebuild the trust or rebuild some kind of consensus about the future of Hong Kong. I think that's a very key. But in terms of law and order, we have to let the system, the court system works the way it has been.
Professor Nolt, when you look at how things have transpired this week, especially with what's happened at the airport, do you think the rule of law there has completely sunk?
Well, I tend to concur that at least so far it looks like law and order has not completely broken down, and the fact that the protests that had shut down the airport have been stopped. The protesters have been restricted to some areas. Obviously, they still have grievances. They're still continuing to protest, but it's not getting completely out of hand. So that there is some degree of legal observation by the protesters, which I think is probably a good sign, because on the one hand, they have the ability to protest the grievances that they have. On the other hand, you don't have complete chaos where a major metropolitan area is cut off from air transport, which is one of its main means of connection with the rest of the world.
When you monitor what's going on in Hong Kong and you take a look at what's happened at the airport, does it give you a sense that the protest has really turned into something, first of all, not peaceful, second of all, something that's dangerous, not just for the people in Hong Kong, but for travelers, tourists that are coming in and leaving Hong Kong?
Well, it's always unfortunate, I think, when protests take a violent turn, and in many cases, what we've seen through history in different protest episodes is that often the violent elements are a small minority, because there are people who have legitimate grievances. They have things that they've been concerned about. There are many long-standing economic and social problems in Hong Kong. And so I think it's reasonable that probably most of the protesters would like to see a peaceful opportunity to protest and not have it turn to violence. I think that's probably true.
Mr. Hong, in Hong Kong, we're looking at other planned rallies and demonstrations this weekend. What do you anticipate will happen this weekend and going into next week?
Well, I can't really anticipate anything because some of these things really has gone beyond my normal knowledge, including what you just mentioned, what happened in the airport. There has been scheduled assembly actually tomorrow in the Victoria Park. According to the news, the police has not approved their demo, in terms of a march. So it should be just an assembly. But as we have observed over the past few weeks, sometimes such a opposition by the police to march do not really stop them from marching. So actually, as we are right now, there are already illegal demonstration on the streets of Mong Kok. Okay, and we're yet to see how that will turn into.
Mr. Hon, are you under the impression that there is a consistent strategy on the part of the protests in the way they demonstrate and get their messages across at this point?
I'm not sure if you could call that a strategy, because one of the odd things of such a demonstration this time is the fact they said there is no leader. So everything is done by consensus according to what they said, and then the consensus kind of changed, including they just say the court order. They actually had an online vote and decided not to go there again. So I'm not sure if that's really the truth, but at least from right now, and one of the problems I think one of the other guest speakers was talking about maybe some dialogue, political dialogue. The problem is if there's a no leader demonstration, how can you create a dialogue? What I have seen though is there is actually a finite number of small number of demonstrators who will turn radical and violent. Okay, not all of them. If you look at some of these larger demonstrations in the earlier days, in early June, for example, they're quite peaceful until the end of, for example, the approved demonstration march. People start to leave. Then will be maybe 1,000, couple hundred people who are left, and these people will turn violent. It seems to I seem to observe such a pattern.
Gentlemen, I want to talk to you both about all of you about the reaction from the business community to what's going on in Hong Kong. Also this week, Li Ka-shing, one of the highest profile businessmen, a business leader in Hong Kong, has put out a statement asking for a stop to the violence there. Mr. Han, just how convincing is that message to protesters and to the violent protesters especially?
Well, actually, of course, I can't answer on behalf of them, right? But the thing is, it's not just Mr. Lee. I mean, we can see the major of all the business community have voiced out in one way or the other. I just came back from a assembly this afternoon where I've seen a few chairmen of some of the largest corporations, local corporations in Hong Kong, and they were there to, pitch for peace. We say no more violence and return to peace. So that was the theme of this assembly, and I can see a lot of very large corporation leaders as well as business leaders, professional leaders, as well as SME, because really our economy has suffered significantly. I mean, if you look at the 5th of August, some of my friends who had a restaurant chain told me they only have 10% of the normal business that day. Okay, so really the retailers are suffering, okay, because the tourists are no longer coming. There was a major, the tourism industry used to be one of the 4 pillars of the Hong Kong local industry, as well as the largest employment. Okay, and now some of my young tourist guide friends are telling me that they are earning about 1/10 of their normal income.
Professor Noel.
So really, I think the business.
Yeah, Mr. Han, hold on. I'm going to come back to you in just a minute. Professor Noel, in terms of these messages and statements from the city's business elites, what could they possibly accomplish at a point in time like this?
Well, of course, I think they're delivering the right message in the sense of calling for peaceful protests rather than violence. But the other thing they have to do as business leaders, as community leaders, is also look at some of the underlying economic problems that have given rise to a lot of youth frustration in Hong Kong and other similarly highly congested cities where the cost of living is very high, the cost of rent and apartments is very high, and sometimes the higher education opportunities and the employment opportunities are not sufficient for the ambitions of the young people. And when people feel they have no future is when they become desperate to do protests and even to turn to violence in some cases. So I think even more effective than words would be if the business community could come up with some solutions that would involve maybe more social outreach, more effort to train local people for employment, or seek constructive ways of solving the economic difficulties that the youth in Hong Kong face.
Mr. He, your take on those statements?
I actually really want to come back to what I said earlier about the conversation and dialogue. Of course, the kind of statement by the very important businessman is going to be very important. Okay, send a very clear message to the society where
well, they don't
standing.
constitute a dialogue because it's one
It's
way.
not. Well, it's a part of the conversation. It's a part of the conversation. Very important for people to have the voice out, right? Business community's voice. But right now, this is probably a critical point for the political leaders, business leaders, to be all part of the conversation. It's got to be really organized. It's not easy, okay? I'm not saying it's really not. It's a challenge. It's something unprecedented. You know, Hong Kong have gone through some tough times before, but I think nobody has a seriously organized, a serious, real, genuine political conversation to resolve all the concerns. I think that's why the violence there, why the huge, the protests that happened, this may still continuing. So this is really the time. I'm pretty sure there are experts out there that
Is
are able to
this
do
a
this.
good and ideal time for conversations when tensions run high and emotions run high?
No, that's not ideal time. You know, we have to do it. I mean, some people have a strategy. They hope that, well, Hong Kong people, you're gonna feel the pain, you're gonna suffer. Maybe eventually you're gonna just let it go. No, they're not gonna let it go. Okay, the anger, the dissatisfaction, the kind of sense of insecurity, or even quote unquote sense of injustice may still be there. I'm not saying they're right. Okay, but they have to be addressed. There are a ton of, tours, probably, opportunity available, but the political leaders have to take the courage. You cannot wait. Like Mr. Hong said, they don't even know who the leaders are. Okay, they're probably more running on the peer-to-peer system. Now, it's really political leaders, institution leaders have to take the accountability to go out, to find a way to deal with it.
I think a lot of people would agree with you in saying that there needs to be a conversation between the government and between the people that are dissatisfied with so many things that are going on. But the problem really is, how do we strike that conversation, and will they listen? Professor Knowlton, your take?
Yeah, well, it's difficult when trust breaks down. And,
exactly.
There's been, and as we said, there were several things that precipitated this. One was the extradition law. Of course, that was sort of a trigger. But really, I think there's so many long-standing concerns. And I think probably a lot of the protesters feel that these are not things that have just suddenly appeared and could be solved with a quick agreement, but things that are long-standing difficulties in the society and may take some really serious social reform to address. So it would be good if the process could start, if there was some way in which a beginning of trust building could occur,
right,
and you could start to lay out an agenda to move things forward. That would be obviously a very positive development. But it's also, a difficult thing perhaps to do.
I think there will be different level of conversation. Okay, we talk about the housing, crisis, economic pressure on the young people. Then there's kind of conversation around there. Okay, and at another level, probably when we're looking at one country, two system. Well, it's really huge, wisdom, right, and making it possible for Hong Kong to come back to China. Now, when you're looking at all the concerns, maybe it's a time for us looking at the regional design. Let's be really honest about it. What works, what has not really working, what kind of thing needs to be done, and any kind of thing we need to be addressed. So it's not like it's not easy, okay, but it's not really rocket science. Of course,
and it's not just one big conversation. It needs to happen step by step. But a lot of conversations.
It's a science.
It is
science. It is science. It really is organizational work. It takes a huge amount of work, but it's possible, okay. But if it's not really addressed properly, it's going to be huge pain to mainland China, to to Hong Kong, and to Asia, to the rest of the world. It's a huge cost.
I hear you, Mr. Hong. Coming back to the economic impact of the protest. You mentioned that business sentiment is down. Tourist arrivals have slowed to the city, given the fact that over a dozen countries have issued travel advisories to the city. On top of that, Hong Kong has already had two very bad quarters in terms of GDP growth. The second quarter registered about 0.5% of economic growth in the city. We have, of course, yet to see the numbers for the third quarter. But given what's going on in the city, what's your expectations for the economic growth?
I think we're definitely going into a recession. I mean, that is almost consensus now. The problem, the issue is how big a recession. You know, I mean, being on the ground, I can tell. Number one, we have a very low unemployment rate. Okay, even at the last quarter, it was 2.8%, which to me that is almost like a negative unemployment. However, we do have a problem of working poor. We do have a problem of higher living standards and high property prices. And also, I think some of the way the communication being done by, for example, both the government and also the elites, you know, the more elderly people with the youth was very different. You know, sometimes the way we communicate is still in the age of television, whereas these people are all on social media. So the kind of terminology, the way they talk, the way they present are very different. The way they convey messages and receive messages are very different. So the dialogue is not just about, let's have a dialogue. And maybe the first thing is to reach out and try to create a conversation in a way the other side can understand. Okay, I mean, I don't think that's a unique problem for Hong Kong, but probably somewhere else as well. I agree there needs to be a dialogue to look into these kind of what we call long outstanding problems that's rooted in the basic Hong Kong economy. But if you look at it, it's not created by one side, one person. It's not created by the government or the tycoons for argument's sake. The fact that we have the freest economy in the world for more than 20 years means everything, it's a free economy, and in a free economy, sometimes this kind of consequence will follow. So maybe it is high time we sit down and think. I don't think, just like you said, it's not one dialogue. Maybe it's a huge heated debate with various stakeholders, not just the youth, but also some of the older people, some of the more educated people. We have a very good education system. So we do. I still think there's not enough universities, but at least we have reasonable number of graduates. But they're not seeing, like, for example, a very high-flying future in the past, because unless you're in the banking and finance industry, we have a very, very narrow kind of industry mix. Okay, because all our factories are gone. We don't have manufacturing in Hong Kong anymore.
Professor Nolt, Mr. He here in the studio, both of you nodded to what Mr. Han was talking about. Now, a lot of the discontent of young people is a direct result of sluggish economic growth in Hong Kong. And if the current situation goes and the economy further suffers, wouldn't that exacerbate things, the foundation of all of that discontent, Professor?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest concern. And add to that the fact that there's increasing evidence of a global slowdown. Although by some measures the United States economy is doing very well right now, there's also a lot of pessimistic sentiment going forward. A number of the big banks have released warnings that signs of recession are increasing. We've got inverted yield curve in bonds. There's a number of other indicators. And there's a considerable slowdown in productive investment. There's still a fairly hot investment market but of course the stock market itself has been turbulent. And in other countries as well. Europe has seen a slowdown. There's financial difficulties in Germany. Of course, Deutsche Bank is in big trouble, one of the biggest banks in Europe. So there's a lot of warning signs in the world economy. And Hong Kong, being so trade dependent, is also affected by the trade conflict between the United States and China, because, of course, a good portion of Chinese trade passes through Hong Kong. And that is another wild card in the whole mix, because recently President Trump has indicated that there may be a link between what's going on in Hong Kong and his position on trade negotiations as well. So that may complicate the issue even further, and both in terms of the economic consequences of the trade conflict and also the political linkage of that to what should be really a local problem.
Given the challenge in external factors, Mr. He, are we looking at a vicious cycle here?
Of course. But the problem is that, it's a tragedy for human being. Okay, it's not for Chinese. Okay, to be honest, really, this is really even for the world when they see those troubled places. people don't want to change. People don't really make anything real change until the real disaster comes in. That's very tragic. Okay. Right now, I think the expert already sort of can see the future in terms of the consequences, the beginning consequences. But people inside it, they don't really want to do anything. They're still angry about it. They even making things violent. And then some people don't really make any moves. Okay. People have probably enough resources, but don't really do that much. Okay. But great. At least some of people are starting making the big statements. Now, I hope it's not a vicious circle. Well, if it's a vicious circle, it may not be that bad. Actually, the real problem is that when this disaster really comes in, okay? But the leadership really have to do something before the disaster really comes. Right now, what will be really great to see is that people like Mr. Li Ka-shing and maybe other more leaders could start from business leaders, okay, but eventually have to see the people from local and even people from outside, from China, the mainland China, from the central government, who all jump in, and it's not like who has more power or more level of power, but it's have to start from all the people.
Professor No, I want to pick up where you left off, talking about President Donald Trump and his position on Hong Kong. I think it's interesting to a lot of people, and also at times confusing, that there seems to be a U.S. element on so many levels here in this crisis. High-ranking U.S. officials have weighed in on the matter, and senior members of the Trump administration meeting with opposition personnel throughout the process. And we're also talking about the U.S. flag, national flag, being seen on multiple occasions here. Why is the United States so active, for the lack of a better word, on this matter?
Well, you have to recognize there's been some shift also within the Trump administration. For the first maybe 2/3 of the protests in Hong Kong, he seemed to take a back seat and kind of praise the Chinese government handling of it rather than being critical at all. And it's only fairly recently, the last few weeks, that he started to make statements that indicate that that he has sympathy for the protests, that he might want to see things continue and maybe even expand in terms of the protests in Hong Kong. And also other American leaders have weighed in on that as well. So I think that's a kind of recent development, partly because of the extension of the protest, the fact that it's gone on for such a long time, that they become more and more interested. Is this developing into something bigger? But another aspect of it is I think Trump has started to recognize that he may have an advantage in the trade negotiations with China if he may think if he can link unrest in Hong Kong and also things like the Taiwan issue and arms sales to Taiwan to the broader questions of U.S.-China trade relations. So Trump has talked about, since his presidential campaign, the idea of doing more linkage. That is, instead of just negotiating trade issues as trade issues, linking them to political issues and sovereignty issues and trying to use every bit of leverage to get what he wants. And this may be a case of that, where he's saying, okay, now there's an opportunity, I can jump in and maybe make things uncomfortable for China in a way that will give me additional leverage in the trade negotiations.
Right. The trade talks have already pretty much been interrupted with his announcement of another 10% tariffs on $300 billion of the Chinese imports. Now, will he be using Hong Kong as a pawn here, and will he succeed?
I think a politician take advantage of all the things, right? When you're in a negotiation, we don't expect him to be helpful, to be honest. This is whatever he's doing, or maybe other people outside China, outside Hong Kong's doing, will make things complicated. But I do want to stress one point. I think we should not really overreact to this quote-unquote foreign influence. Okay, we should not overreact. I think our politician, our political leaders should be really fully confident that, hey, Hong Kong is always a part of China, all right? All this unrest will not change anything fundamental, okay? I think we should be really confident about that. And this is not really part of the bigger, part of like a color revolution. I really don't believe that. Of course, it makes things complicated. All this outside influence, but we probably give way too much credit to this foreign influence to make this happen, to make this unrest happen. I think all the political leaders should take a fully accountability to deal with whatever we are having right now.
Mr. Hong, I want to get your take also on the United States' role in the ongoing crisis in Hong Kong.
Well, I think the other guest, I can't totally agree with him. I think we are seeing a lot of hints of different foreign influences. They just said there are open ones, which are those political leaders commenting, meeting with the opposition several times, threatening of this and that, and also, of course, the recent one of using it as a negotiation as part of the trade negotiation. But what we're also seeing is, you know, locally foreigners participating, and in fact, on certain occasions, if you look at some of the videos, they are actually commanding some of these demonstrations. Now, I don't know who they are and where they come from. So, but we're definitely seeing that. And then also, if you look at some of the weapons and the quote demonstrators are using, okay, I know for a fact that the police have confiscated 3 container loads of such equipment. I would say maybe it's not weapons, probably not the right word, but equipment directly shipped from the United States. Now, who shipped that? I don't know. It may be sovereignty, it may be somebody else, it could be somebody from Hong Kong who just placed an order on Amazon. But the thing is, we are seeing hints of such things here and there. I am obviously not in a position to judge whether they are real foreign influences or not influences, but interference or things like that. But at least from the surface of our observation, one should raise such a question. And I think it's very normal for one to raise such questions.
Well, gentlemen, we don't have a lot of time left. I want to get from each of you. There is no quick fix to this. Absolutely. But Mr. Han, what could governments, both the SAR government and the central government, do to encourage conversation like we've been talking about on the program and to possibly bring an end to all of this?
I think from Hong Kong point of view, I mean, the government had always been demonstrating their willingness to dialogue.
Absolutely.
The problem is finding the right person, finding the person to have a talk. At least I think that what we need to do is really separate. On one side, people who are really doing, you know, violent and breaking the law. These people need to be stopped, either by the police or by themselves. You know, I think what we need to do is, if they were really demonstration leaders, that these leaders need to make it known to their people that violence is just not a solution. On the other hand, what we need to do is, I think community leaders like myself and like some of the tycoons, they can come out and say, okay, let's have a conversation. The conversation is not about who's right or who's wrong in this particular incident.
I see.
The conversation is about what kind of Hong Kong, what kind of city do we want in the future. And maybe this is high time we sit down and say, okay, let's look at our options. I mean, I'm not too pessimistic in terms of economic outlook, because it's not, Hong Kong is not alone. Yes, it's a trade-dependent city, but recently we have this Greater Bay Area thing, which is the part of Guangdong provinces that really integrating with Hong Kong on an economic sense, and that will really give a lot of new job opportunities in terms of manufacturing, in terms of technology. That were,
Mr. Han, I'm sorry to cut you off. Let me get final ending remarks from my other guests here in the studio. Mr. He, please.
I think you've got to start from listening. I think all of this important stakeholders need to find a way to listen to each other. I think we are spending way too much time to complain, to make it even making force, but we're not really listening.
Gotcha. Professor Nolt.
I think, too, that this has to be an opportunity to look for broader solutions, because these are long-standing problems that have caused a lot of anxiety and apprehension about the future for many youth in Hong Kong. So I think if the people protesting could see that there's an opening to some potential for progress, that may indeed be a way to make a hopeful end to this.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Holt here in the studio, and Mr. He and Mr. Han in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for your input today. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. I'm Zhong Shi in Beijing. Thank you for your company.